A pregnant woman trapped in a flood begged for help, but everyone walked away. When a skinny 13-year-old boy jumped into the raging waters, she couldn't believe what he whispered to her. The weatherman's voice crackled through the old TV set in Tyson's living room. Houston residents should prepare for what could be the worst storm in recent history. We're looking at potential rainfall of up to 20 inches in the next 24 hours. Tyson Walker sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, his long fingers drumming against his knee. At 13, he was already tall enough to bump his head on the low door frames of their rental house. The ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, pushing around the thick, humid air that always seemed to hang in their home. "Mom," he called out, eyes fixed on the radar map, showing massive red and purple clouds approaching the Texas coast. "You need to see this." Sarah Walker emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her faded jeans. Her cleaning uniform hung on a hook by the door, ready for tomorrow's shift. "What is it, baby?" "They're saying it's going to be bad." "Like really bad?" Tyson pointed at the screen where the meteorologist was gesturing at the growing storm system. His mother's face tightened as she watched the forecast. The expression reminded Tyson of the day they got the news about Marcus. His older brother's face had been all over the local news 3 years ago. Another young black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, convicted on circumstantial evidence that wouldn't have held up if he'd been able to afford a better lawyer than the overworked public defender. A loud knock at the door made them both jump. Sarah moved quickly to answer it, but Tyson saw her hesitate for a moment when she recognized their landlord's silhouette through the frosted glass. "Mrs. Walker." Mr. Peterson didn't wait for an invitation before stepping inside. His boots left muddy prints on the linoleum. "I assume you know why I'm here." Sarah straightened her spine. "Mr. Peterson, I told you we'd have the rent by the end of the week. My husband's got a new construction job starting dash. That's what you said last month?" He thrust a paper into her hands. "This is your final notice. You've got 72 hours to come up with the back rent, or I'm starting eviction proceedings." Tyson's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to say something, to defend his mother, but he knew from experience that would only make things worse. "Please," Sarah's voice wavered slightly. "With this storm coming dash, not my problem." Peterson turned toward the door, then paused. 3 days, Mrs. Walker. Not 1 day more." The door slammed behind him. Sarah stood there for a long moment, staring at the notice in her hands. Finally, she folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket. "It's going to be okay, baby," she said, but Tyson heard the tremor in her voice. "Your daddy's got that new job, and I picked up some extra hours at the Wilson house." Before Tyson could respond, his father's key turned in the lock. James Walker ducked through the doorway, his work clothes covered in concrete dust. "They're sending everyone home early," he announced, shaking his head. "Site's shutting down until the storm passes. Foreman says it could be a few days." He saw their faces and stopped. "What happened?" Sarah pulled the notice from her pocket and handed it to him. James read it quickly, his jaw tightening. "That Snake Peterson was here?" He crumpled the paper in his fist. "In my house." "James, please." Sarah touched his arm. "Not now. We need to get ready for this storm." Thunder rumbled in the distance, as if emphasizing her point. Tyson got up and went to the window. The sky had turned an eerie greenish-gray, and the first fat drops of rain were starting to fall. They ate dinner at the kitchen table, rice and beans with the last of the chicken from Sunday's dinner. The radio on the counter alternated between static and emergency broadcasts. Tyson pushed his food around his plate, listening to the warnings about flood-prone areas. Their neighborhood was at the bottom of a slight hill, and he remembered how the water had risen past the front steps during the last big storm. "You both got your phones charged?" James asked between bites. "Keep them plugged in while we still got power." Sarah nodded. "I filled the bathtub and some buckets too. Got those battery lanterns from the dollar store working." The lights flickered as another thunderclap shook the house. Tyson's phone buzzed with a severe weather alert. He read it aloud. Flash flood warning for Harris County. Residents in low-lying areas should prepare for possible evacuation. "We ain't going nowhere," James said firmly. "This is our home." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "We've weathered storms before." But Tyson saw the worry in their eyes as they looked at each other. Outside, the rain was falling harder now, drumming against the windows. The wind had picked up too, making the old house creak and groan. His phone buzzed again. Another alert, this time about road closures. The battery indicator showed 89%. Tyson thought about his brother in his cell at the state prison, wondering if Marcus was watching the same storm roll in through the barred windows. The lights flickered again, longer this time. In the moment of darkness, Tyson heard his mother's sharp intake of breath. When the power came back on, they all pretended not to notice how their hands had instinctively reached for each other across the table. "Maybe we should get the emergency bag ready," Tyson suggested. "Just in case." James started to protest, but Sarah cut him off. "He's right. Better to be prepared." They spent the next hour gathering essentials: flashlights, batteries, non-perishable food, first aid supplies, important documents. The radio warned of possible power outages lasting several days. The rain fell steadily harder. Tyson was checking the batteries in the last flashlight when all the lights went out at once. This time they didn't come back on. In the sudden darkness, he could hear water starting to gurgle in the storm drains outside. "Everyone stay calm." His father's voice came from somewhere in the kitchen. "Tyson, get those lanterns." But before Tyson could move, a sound cut through the darkness. A long, low moan of wind that made the windows rattle in their frames. The storm was just beginning. The glow of his phone screen illuminated his parents' faces as they huddled together in the dark kitchen. Sarah was clutching James's arm, and Tyson saw real fear in his father's eyes for the first time he could remember. "Lord help us," Sarah whispered, just as another gust of wind howled around the house. "Lord help us all." Water began seeping under the front door. Dawn brought no relief. The rain hadn't stopped for a moment, and now the water in Tyson's street was ankle-deep. He stood at his front window, watching as Mrs. Rodriguez from next door struggled to stack sandbags around her porch. "I'm going to help her," he told his parents, already pulling on his rain boots. "Tyson, wait!" his mother started, but his father cut her off. "Let him go, Sarah. Mrs. Rodriguez lives alone." James handed Tyson a raincoat. "Be careful, son. Water's rising fast." The rain hit Tyson's face like tiny needles as he splashed across the yard. Mrs. Rodriguez looked up as he approached, her gray hair plastered to her forehead. "Tyson, go back inside, Mijo. It's not safe." "I'm already here." He grabbed a sandbag from her pile. "Where do you need these?" They worked together in the rain, stacking bags against her door. The water kept rising, now halfway up Tyson's calves. His socks were soaked inside his boots. "My Carlos used to do this," Mrs. Rodriguez said, breathing hard as they placed another bag. "Every storm. He knew just where to put them." She wiped rain from her eyes. "Since he passed." A crash from down the street interrupted her. Through the rain, Tyson saw Mr. Washington's trash cans floating away, spilling garbage into the floodwaters. "We need to call emergency services," Mrs. Rodriguez said, pulling out her phone. Tyson already had his phone out, dialing 911. The line rang once, twice, then a recorded message. "All operators are currently busy. If this is an emergency." "Nothing," he told Mrs. Rodriguez. "Lines are jammed." They finished the sandbags just as Tyson's phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "Get back inside now." "Mrs. Rodriguez, you should come with us," he said. "Our house is a little higher." She shook her head. "I can't leave my home, Mijo. Carlos's pictures." "Then at least come up on the porch." "Water's getting deeper." They climbed onto her porch, watching as the street transformed into a river. Cars that hadn't been moved to higher ground began to float, bumping against each other like slow-motion bumper cars. Tyson's phone buzzed again. This time it was his father. "Son, where are you?" His fingers shook as he typed, "Mrs. Rodriguez porch. Coming back soon." The response was immediate. "Be careful. Street's dangerous." "A police car, sir." N wailed in the distance, then cut off abruptly. The water was moving faster now, carrying branches, trash cans, and pieces of fencing. Tyson remembered the community center where he'd learned to swim last summer. The instructor teaching them about current safety, how to avoid being swept away. "Look," Mrs. Rodriguez pointed toward the wealthier part of the neighborhood, where the big houses sat on slightly higher ground. A line of expensive cars was trying to evacuate, their headlights cutting through the rain. Tyson watched as a black SUV attempted to turn around, its wheels spinning. Water sprayed from its exhaust. Then slowly it began to drift sideways. "They're going to get stuck," he said. More cars were backing up behind the SUV, honking uselessly. Through the rain, Tyson could see people getting out of their vehicles, abandoning them to the rising water. His phone rang. His mother again. "Baby, please come home now. Water's coming up the steps." "I'm coming, Mom. Just need to make sure." Mrs. Rodriguez dash. "Dios mío." Mrs. Rodriguez's cry cut him off. "Look there." Through the curtain of rain, Tyson saw what had caught her attention. A silver luxury car had tried to take a different route, but the water was too deep. It was starting to float, turning slowly in the current. Someone was inside. "There's a woman in there." Mrs. Rodriguez grabbed his arm. "Tyson, there's someone dash. I see her." He squinted through the rain. The car's interior lights were on, showing a woman in the driver's seat. She was banging on the window, her mouth open in what must have been a scream, though the sound was lost in the storm. Tyson's phone rang again. This time it was his father. "Son, where are you?" "Water's rising fast." "Dad, there's a car floating down by the Parker house. Someone's trapped inside." "Don't you dare, Tyson. You stay right where you are. You hear me?" "Emergency services dash. Nobody's coming, Dad. The phones aren't working." Other people had noticed the car now. A group of men stood at the edge of the water, shouting and pointing. None of them moved to help. The car was turning faster now, caught in the current. The woman's face appeared at the window again, and this time Tyson could see her clearly. Blonde hair, wide eyes full of terror. She pressed something white against the glass, a piece of paper with writing he couldn't make out. "She's pregnant," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered. "Santa Maria." She was right. Even through the rain and the car windows, Tyson could see the woman's swollen belly. She was very pregnant. His phone buzzed continuously now, his parents calling, texting. The water was up to the porch steps. Mrs. Rodriguez was crying, praying in Spanish. "I have to help," Tyson said. "No, Mijo, you can't." The current dashed, but he was already pulling off his raincoat. The water that had seemed so cold before now barely registered. His hands shook as he untied his boots. "Tell my parents," he started, then stopped. What could he say? The car was moving faster, carried by the floodwaters. Soon it would be past them. The woman appeared at the window again, pounding with both hands now. Her mouth formed words he couldn't hear. Tyson thought of Marcus, alone in his cell. Of his parents, waiting for him to come home. Of the swimming instructor's warnings about floodwaters. Then he stepped off the porch into the rushing current. The last thing he heard was Mrs. Rodriguez screaming his name, her voice lost in the roar of the storm. The water hit him like a fist. The current yanked Tyson's feet out from under him. He went under for a second, swallowing dirty water before his swimming training kicked in. Kick hard. Keep your head up. Don't fight the current directly. He surfaced, gasping. The car was 30 yards ahead, moving faster now. Through the rain, he could make out the woman's face pressed against the rear window. Her eyes met his, and her mouth moved, forming words he couldn't hear. "I'm coming," he shouted, but the wind tore his words away. Something solid hit his leg underwater. A mailbox, maybe, or a trash can. Tyson grunted in pain, but kept swimming. The community center pool hadn't prepared him for this. The water was freezing, filled with debris, and moving so fast it made his head spin. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He'd forgotten to take it out. Too late now. The car spun slowly in the current, its front end dipping lower. Water must be getting in. Tyson's muscles burned as he fought to get closer. 10 yards now. He could see the woman more clearly. Blonde hair plastered to her face, hands pressed against the glass. She was wearing expensive clothes, designer brands like the ones his mother cleaned at the Wilson house. This must be one of those people from the wealthy part of town trying to evacuate too late. Another piece of debris slammed into him. This time it was a wooden fence post, and it caught him right in the ribs. Pain exploded through his chest. He went under again, tumbling in the current. "Don't panic." The swimming instructor's voice in his head. "Find the surface. Get your bearings." He kicked hard and broke through, coughing and spluttering. The car was still there, but it had moved another 20 feet downstream. The The woman saw him surface and pounded on the window. That's when Tyson noticed the paper she was holding up. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could make out the words, "Baby coming." His heart stopped for a moment. She wasn't just pregnant, she was in labor. A fresh surge of adrenaline pushed him forward. He'd seen his cousin give birth last year, remembered how scared everyone had been even in the safety of a hospital. This woman was alone, trapped, with flood waters rising. The car hit something underwater and jerked violently. The woman disappeared from the window, thrown by the impact. When she reappeared, Tyson saw blood on her forehead where she'd hit the glass. "Hold on," he screamed against the wind. "I'm almost there." 5 yards now. He could see the car's license plate, a custom one that read Henderson. The water was up to the bottom of the windows. His legs were going numb from the cold. Each stroke felt like moving through concrete. But he was closing the distance. 4 yards. 3. The woman's face appeared at the closest window. Up close, he could see the terror in her eyes, but also something else, recognition. She'd realized how young he was, and now she was shaking her head. "Go back," he could see her mouth the words. "Too dangerous." Another impact underwater, harder this time. Something sharp scraped along his leg, cutting through his jeans. Warm blood mixed with the cold flood water. 2 yards. The car was mostly underwater now. He had maybe minutes before it filled completely. His phone buzzed again in his pocket. Mom and Dad would be going crazy. Mrs. Rodriguez had probably told them what he was doing. He pushed the thought away. Focus. The woman pressed her hand against the glass. She was crying, shaking her head. "Save yourself," her eyes seemed to say. 1 yard. The current pinned him against the car's side. Up close, he could see it was a Mercedes, probably worth more than his family's house. The door handle was underwater. Tyson took a deep breath and ducked under. The water was brown, impossible to see through. He felt along the door, found the handle, pulled. Nothing. The pressure was too strong. He surfaced, gulping air. The woman was watching him, her face pale. She made a rolling motion with her hand. The window controls. Maybe they still worked, but when she pressed the button, nothing happened. The car's electronics were dead. Tyson felt along the roof until he found the trim around the window. His fingers were so numb he could barely grip it. He pulled himself closer, getting his face near the glass. "Back up," he shouted. The woman nodded and moved away from the window. With the last of his strength, Tyson drew up his legs and kicked the window as hard as he could. Pain shot through his foot, but the glass held. Again, the window cracked. One more time. The safety glass spiderwebbed, but stayed in place. The car was almost completely submerged now. Only a foot of airspace remained inside. The woman's face was pressed against the roof, gasping in the last pocket of air. Tyson's muscles screamed as he pulled back for one final kick. This had to work. If it didn't, he kicked with everything he had left. The glass finally shattered, fragments washing away in the current. Water rushed into the car. The woman's scream was cut off as the flood poured through the broken window. Tyson gulped air and dove in after her. Inside the car was pitch black. His hands found fabric, her shirt. He pulled, but she was caught on something. Her seatbelt was still fastened. His lungs burned. He couldn't see the buckle. His fingers scrambled against the mechanism. Just as spots started dancing in his vision, the belt clicked free. He pulled the woman toward the window. She wasn't moving. Unconscious? No time to check. The current helped now, sucking them both through the broken window. Tyson kicked hard, not sure which way was up. His head hit something solid, the car's roof. He pushed off it, pulling the woman with him. They broke the surface together. She gasped and coughed, alive. "Hold on to me," he managed to shout between breaths. Her arms wrapped around his neck, almost pulling him under again. The current was stronger than ever. They spun past houses Tyson knew, windows glowing with emergency lights. People stood on porches, pointing and shouting. The woman's grip started to loosen. "Can't," she gasped. "The baby. Stay with me." Tyson fought to keep them both above water. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she coughed. "Sarah Henderson." Henderson. Like the license plate. Like the billionaire real estate developer he'd seen on the news. Another wave hit them, filling their mouths with flood water. When Tyson could breathe again, he heard Sarah cry out in pain. Contraction, she gasped. Oh God! They were running out of time. His legs felt like lead. The cold was seeping into his bones. Through the rain, he spotted a porch light that looked familiar. Mrs. Rodriguez's house. They'd been carried in a circle by the current. Little more, he croaked. Almost there. Sarah's only response was another cry of pain. Her fingernails dug into his shoulders. The porch was 10 feet away. 5. Tyson reached out with his free hand, fingers brushing the bottom step. Then the current caught them one last time, threatening to pull them away. His grip slipped. A hand grabbed his wrist. Several hands. We got you, son. A voice he recognized, Mr. Washington from down the street. Pull. More hands reached for them. Sarah's weight lifted from his shoulders as people helped her onto the porch. Someone dragged Tyson up after her. He lay on the wooden boards, rain pelting his face, lungs burning with every breath. Voices swirled around him. Call an ambulance. The roads are blocked. She's in labor. Get them inside. Sarah's face appeared above him, water dripping from her hair. Despite her pain, she gripped his hand. You saved us, she whispered. You saved my baby. Then another contraction hit her, and she screamed. The last thing Tyson saw before exhaustion took him was Mrs. Rodriguez's face, tears mixing with rain as she made the sign of the cross. Madre de Dios, she was saying. Madre de Dios. The storm raged on. Tyson woke to the sound of screaming. His whole body ached, and something rough scratched against his cheek, a wool blanket. He was lying on Mrs. Rodriguez's living room floor. The baby's coming, someone shouted. We need towels. He pushed himself up. On shaking arms, Sarah Henderson lay on the couch, her wet clothes replaced by one of Mrs. Rodriguez's nightgowns. Her face was red with effort, teeth clenched against another contraction. Someone call my husband, she gasped. Please. Mrs. Rodriguez knelt beside her, holding her hand. The phones aren't working, Majida, but we're here. We'll help you. Tyson's own phone was dead, waterlogged in his pocket. His jeans were still soaked, leaving a puddle on the floor. The cut on his leg stung. Tyson, his mother's voice. She burst through the front door, rain dripping from her clothes. Oh, thank God. She wrapped him in a fierce hug, then pulled back to examine him. Are you hurt? What were you thinking? We were so worried. Another scream from Sarah cut her off. Sarah's eyes found Tyson's across the room. The boy, she panted. Is he okay? I'm fine, Tyson called back, trying to stand. His legs wobbled like jelly. His father appeared in the doorway, carrying more blankets. Son, you're the craziest, bravest. He stopped, seeing Sarah. Ma'am, we've got people trying to get through to emergency services. No time, Mrs. Rodriguez said. This baby isn't waiting. Sarah, Majida, when was your last contraction? 2 minutes? Sarah's hands clutched her belly. Maybe less. Oh God, here comes another one. The room erupted into action. Mrs. Washington, who'd been a nurse before retiring, took charge. We need clean towels, hot water if possible, and someone find a first aid kit. Tyson's mother squeezed his shoulder. Come on, baby. Let's get you dried off before you catch pneumonia. No, Sarah reached out. Please, can he stay? He saved us. I need another contraction hit, and she screamed. I'll stay, Tyson said. His mother started to protest, but Mrs. Washington cut her off. Let him stay. Sometimes having a focal point helps with the pain. Sarah, honey, focus on your rescuer. Remember how strong he was in that water? You can be strong too. Thunder crashed outside. The storm wasn't letting up. Through the windows, Tyson could see debris floating past. Trash cans, branches, pieces of fencing. The water level had risen another foot. Contractions are less than 2 minutes apart, Mrs. Washington announced. Sarah, honey, this baby's coming fast. Next contraction, I need you to push. Sarah's grip on Mrs. Rodriguez's hand tightened. But my doctor, the hospital, your baby's not waiting for either, Mrs. Washington said firmly. Now breathe, just like they taught you in those fancy classes. Tyson moved closer to the couch, his legs steadier now. Sarah's face was pale despite the effort of labor, a bruise forming where she'd hit her head in the car. Their eyes met. You're so young, she whispered. I didn't realize in the water. How old are you? 13. 13, she repeated. Then her face contorted with another contraction. Push, Mrs. Washington commanded. That's a good girl. Sarah screamed, crushing Mrs. Rodriguez's hand. Tyson found himself holding his breath. The head's crowning, Mrs. Washington announced. One more big push, honey. You can do this. Outside, the wind howled. Water seeped under the front door despite the sandbags. But inside, everyone's attention was focused on Sarah as she gathered her strength for one final effort. Tell me, she gasped, looking at Tyson. Tell me why. Why did you jump in? Tyson thought about it. Because nobody else would. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Then another contraction gripped her, and she pushed with everything she had. A new cry filled the room. Tiny, angry, alive. It's a girl. Mrs. Washington held up the squalling infant. A beautiful baby girl. Mrs. Rodriguez was crying. Tyson's mother pressed her hands to her mouth. His father wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Let me see her. Sarah reached out. Mrs. Washington laid the baby on her chest, wrapped in a clean towel. She's perfect, Sarah whispered, touching the baby's face. She's alive because of you. She looked at Tyson. You saved both of us. The baby's cries grew stronger. Outside, the storm raged on, but in here, in this moment, there was only the miracle of new life. What's her name? Mrs. Rodriguez asked softly. Sarah didn't take her eyes off her daughter. Hope, she said. Her name is Hope. A loud crack of thunder made everyone jump. Water was streaming under the door now, despite the sandbags. We need to move to higher ground, Mr. Washington said from the window. Water's still rising. Sarah clutched her baby closer. I can't. I just had her. The second floor, Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. We'll help you. Carlos's old room is up there. It took all of them working together to get Sarah and the baby upstairs. Tyson's leg throbbed as he helped support her weight. The cut was still bleeding slightly. They settled Sarah and Hope in Carlos's old room. The bed was musty but dry. Through the window, they could see the extent of the flooding. Their neighborhood had become a lake, punctuated by rooftops and treetops. Try the phones again, Sarah said weakly. My husband, he needs to know. But there was still no signal. The storm had knocked out cell towers across the city. Mrs. Washington checked Sarah's vital signs. Mother and baby are doing well, all things considered. But they'll need medical attention as soon as possible. Tyson stood by the window, watching the water rise. His clothes were finally starting to dry, but he couldn't stop shivering. The image of the car filling with water kept playing in his mind. Tyson, Sarah's voice was soft. She held out her hand. Come meet your goddaughter. He approached the bed carefully. Hope was sleeping now, her tiny face peaceful despite the chaos around them. I can't be her godfather, he said. I don't even know you. You risked your life to save ours. Sarah touched his arm. That's all I need to know. Another thunderclap shook the house. Hope stirred but didn't wake. My husband? Sarah's voice cracked. Robert Henderson. When he finds out, he'll want to thank you properly. Henderson. The name finally clicked fully in Tyson's tired brain. Robert Henderson, the real estate developer. The billionaire who owned half of downtown Houston. I didn't know who you were, he said. In the water. It wouldn't have mattered anyway. Sarah smiled. I know. That's what makes you special, Tyson Walker. From downstairs came the sound of splashing, water pouring into the first floor. The storm wasn't finished with them yet. But up here, watching this woman he'd saved holding her newborn daughter, Tyson felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, not since Marcus was taken away. Hope! The baby stirred again, opening her eyes. They were dark and unfocused, but they seemed to find Tyson's face. Welcome to the world, Hope Henderson, he whispered. You picked one hell of a day to arrive. The water kept rising. From the second-floor window, Tyson watched as cars disappeared beneath the muddy flood. The rain drummed against the roof, constant and heavy. How long has it been? Sarah asked from the bed. She was nursing Hope, trying to keep the baby calm despite the storm. Tyson checked his father's watch. His own phone was still dead. For hours since the rescue. Since he'd pulled them from the sinking car. His muscles still ached from fighting the current. The cut on his leg had stopped bleeding, but it stung when he moved. Mrs. Washington came in with a bottle of water. Small sips, she told Sarah. We need to keep you hydrated. The old nurse had been checking on mother and baby every 15 minutes. Without proper medical equipment, she was relying on decades of experience and instinct. Any signal yet? Sarah asked. Tyson shook his head. The storm had knocked out cell service across the city. They were cut off. A crash from downstairs made everyone jump. Mr. Washington's voice carried up. First floor's flooded. Everyone stay up here. Hope started crying. Sarah rocked her gently, wincing. Shoo, baby girl. It's okay. Tyson's parents appeared in the doorway. His father's clothes were soaked to the knees. Water's up to the 4th step, James reported. Mrs. Rodriguez's furniture's floating. James, Sarah called out. Mr. Walker, I need to ask you something. Tyson's father stepped into the room, dripping on the old carpet. Yes, ma'am. Your son. Sarah held Hope closer. He risked his life for us. Why? James looked at Tyson, pride mixing with lingering fear in his eyes. That's just who he is, ma'am. Ever since his brother, he trailed off, but Sarah caught it. Brother? Marcus, Tyson said quietly. He's in prison. 3 years now. For something he didn't do. Understanding flickered across Sarah's face. That's why you jumped in. Because you couldn't help him. Tyson hadn't thought about it that way, but maybe she was right. He'd been helpless when they took Marcus away. But today, he'd had a choice. Thunder rattled the windows. Hope cried louder. Robert will help, Sarah said suddenly. My husband, he has connections. Lawyers. When he finds out what you did. We don't need charity, James started, but Sarah cut him off. It's not charity. It's justice. She looked at Tyson. You saved 2 lives today. Let us help save your brothers. Before anyone could respond, Mrs. Washington burst in. Coast Guard helicopter. They're trying to land. Everyone rushed to the window. Through the rain, they could see the helicopter hovering over the neighborhood, searchlight cutting through the gloom. They can't land in this, James said. Wind's too strong. He was right. The helicopter circled twice, then moved away, its sound fading into the storm. Sarah made a small sound of despair. Hope sensed her mother's distress and began wailing again. They'll be back, Tyson said firmly. They know we're here now. Mrs. Washington nodded. He's right, but we need to be ready when they come. Sarah, how do you feel about moving? Sarah looked down at her newborn. I don't know if I can. You have to, the nurse said gently. When rescue comes, we'll need to move fast. Let's try sitting up first. Tyson moved to help, but his injured leg buckled. His mother caught him. You need rest too, she said. Both of you do. But Sarah reached for Tyson's hand. Stay, please. You're the only one who. She swallowed hard. Who knows what it felt like? In the water. Tyson nodded. He didn't know. The cold, the fear, the certainty that each breath could be their last. Mrs. Washington helped Sarah sit up slowly. The woman was pale but determined. Hope had settled against her chest. Tiny fingers curled around her mother's hospital gown. Tell me about Marcus, Sarah said as Mrs. Washington checked her blood pressure. So Tyson told her. About the night the police came, the trial that lasted less than a day. The public defender who seemed half asleep. The evidence that didn't add up but was enough for an all-white jury. 3 years, he finished, for a robbery he didn't commit. Sarah listened intently, one hand stroking Hope's back. My husband's firm has a whole team of criminal defense lawyers. The best in Texas. Once he learns what happened, why would he help? Tyson's father asked from the doorway. No offense, ma'am, but rich folks don't usually care about people like us. Because your son didn't care that I was rich folk when he saw someone in trouble. Sarah's voice was firm. He just saw a person who needed help. A gust of wind rattled the windows. The storm was getting stronger again. Robert's probably going crazy trying to find me, Sarah said softly. The last thing I texted him was that I was trying to get out of the neighborhood. He'll find you, Tyson's mother assured her. A man like that, he's got resources. Yes, Sarah looked at Hope. But if he'd found me 10 minutes later, she shuddered. The water was up to my neck when Tyson reached us. The memory hit Tyson hard. The car filling with water, Sarah's face pressed against the glass. He gripped the windowsill to steady himself. Tyson? His mother touched his arm. You okay, baby? Yeah. He forced himself to breathe normally. Just tired. Here? Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with a kitchen chair. Sit before you fall. He sank into the chair gratefully. His leg throbbed where the debris had cut him. I was scared too, Sarah said quietly. In the car, I kept thinking about Hope, about how she'd never even get a chance. She wiped her eyes. Then I saw this skinny black kid swimming toward me, and I thought he was crazy. But there was something in your eyes. What? Tyson asked when she paused. Determination. Like nothing was going to stop you. She smiled sadly. The same look Marcus probably had when they arrested him. The look that says, I know what's right. Hope stirred, making little snuffling noises. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Mrs. Henderson, Tyson started. Sarah, she corrected. After what we've been through, please call me Sarah. Sarah, you don't have to help with Marcus. You don't owe us anything. I owe you everything. Her voice cracked. My life. My daughter's life. And please don't tell me it was nothing. We both know how close it was. Before Tyson could respond, a new sound cut through the storm. Helicopter blades, closer this time. Everyone rushed to the window. 2 Coast Guard helicopters were approaching, their searchlights sweeping the flooded neighborhood. They're coming back, James said. This time they mean business. Sarah clutched Hope tighter. How will we? One step at a time, Mrs. Washington said firmly. Let's get you ready to move. As the others helped Sarah prepare, Tyson stayed by the window, watching the helicopters draw closer. The past few hours felt like a dream. The flood, the rescue, the baby's birth. But it was real. All of it. And somehow, impossibly, they'd all survived. Hope made a small sound like a question. Tyson turned to look at the tiny girl who'd come into the world in the middle of a hurricane. Don't worry, he whispered. The worst is over. The helicopters grew louder, drowning out the sound of the rain. The helicopter's spotlight blazed through the window, turning night into day. Hope wailed at the noise, her tiny fists clenched. Coast Guard rescue. A voice boomed through a megaphone. Is anyone in need of immediate medical attention? Mr. Washington leaned out the window, waving his arms yes. We have a woman who just gave birth. The helicopter hovered closer, its rotors whipping the rain into stinging sheets. A rescue worker in an orange suit appeared in the doorway of the aircraft. How many people? The megaphone crackled. 8, Mr. Washington shouted back, including the mother and newborn. The rescue worker made a hand signal to the pilot. The helicopter edged closer to the house, but the wind kept pushing it back. Too unstable, the megaphone announced. Can't get close enough. We'll need to send down a basket. Sarah clutched Hope tighter. A basket? In this wind? Mrs. Washington squeezed her shoulder. It's our only choice, honey. You and the baby need a hospital. The rescue basket swung wildly as it was lowered, almost hitting the house before the wind caught it again. Tyson watched it dance in the air, his stomach turning. Mother and baby first, the voice commanded. Then the injured. Everyone looked at Tyson's leg. The cut had stopped bleeding, but the skin around it was angry and red. No, he said. Sarah and Hope go first, then the others. I'll go last. Tyson dashed. His mother started to protest. I can still walk. They need help more. The basket finally reached the window, banging against the side of the house. 2 Coast Guard rescuers rappelled down after it. Ma'am, one of them addressed Sarah. We need to move quickly. Storm's getting worse. Sarah tried to stand, but her legs shook. I can't. I've got you. Tyson moved to help her, ignoring the pain in his leg. Just like in the water, remember? Trust me. She nodded, letting him and the rescuer support her weight. Hope was bundled tightly against her chest, protected from the rain by Mrs. Rodriguez's best blanket. Easy now, the rescuer guided them. Watch your step. Getting Sarah into the basket was like a dangerous dance. The wind kept trying to snatch it away, while the rain made everything slippery. Tyson held her steady until she was safely inside with Hope. Ready for lift, the rescuer called. The basket began to rise. Sarah's eyes met Tyson's one last time before she disappeared into the rain. Next group, the second rescuers shouted over the storm. We need to hurry. They sent the older folks up first, Mrs. Rodriguez and the Washingtons. The basket swayed worse each time, the wind growing stronger. Something's wrong, the first rescuer shouted, checking a handheld radio. Second storm cell approaching. 10 minutes max. Tyson's parents were next. His mother didn't want to leave him, but his father practically carried her to the basket. We'll see you up there, son, James called as they rose into the darkness. Now it was just Tyson and the two rescuers. The house groaned beneath them as flood waters attacked its foundation. Your turn, kid, one rescuer said. Let's get that leg looked at. The basket came down one last time. But before they could reach it, a sound like a gunshot rang out. The whole house shuddered. Foundation's going, the second rescuer yelled. Move, move. Tyson lunged for the basket, but his injured leg gave out. He sprawled on the wet floor as the house shook again. I got you. The first rescuer grabbed his arm, hauling him up. Together, they half-carried Tyson to the window. The basket was spinning in the wind, almost impossible to grab. Rain poured through the window, soaking them. Another crack from below. The floor tilted slightly. Jump for it, the rescuer ordered. Now! Tyson pushed off with his good leg, reaching for the basket. For a moment, he was suspended in space, the wind trying to tear him away. Then his hands found the metal rim. The rescuer behind him helped push him in. Go, 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 someone screamed into a radio. The fluorescent lights of Houston Methodist Hospital buzzed overhead. Tyson sat on an emergency room bed, watching a doctor clean and stitch the gash in his leg. The local anesthetic made his calf feel like it was floating. 13 stitches, the doctor announced. You're lucky it wasn't deeper. Lucky. Everyone kept using that word. Tyson didn't feel lucky. He felt tired. Bone tired. How's Mrs. Henderson? He asked. They'd separated them when the helicopter landed, rushing Sarah and Hope to the maternity ward. The billionaire's wife? The doctor tied off the last stitch. Half the hospital administration is up there. Mother and baby are doing fine, from what I hear. A commotion erupted in the hallway. Raised voices, rushing feet, the squeak of expensive shoes on linoleum. That's my wife, a man's voice boomed. Where is she? Tyson's parents, who'd been dozing in plastic chairs, jerked awake. His mother squeezed his hand. A tall man in a rumpled business suit burst into the room, followed by several hospital administrators and what looked like private security. Robert Henderson's face was red, his tie askew. Where's the boy? He demanded. The one who saved them? Everyone pointed at Tyson. Henderson stopped short, taking in Tyson's appearance. The hospital gown, the bandaged leg, the exhaustion written on his face. You? His voice cracked. You're the one who... Tyson nodded, too tired for words. Henderson crossed the room in 3 long strides and did something completely unexpected. He fell to his knees beside Tyson's bed and began to cry. Thank you, he sobbed, gripping Tyson's hand. Thank you. Thank you. James Walker stepped forward protectively, but Henderson was already standing, wiping his eyes. Sorry, he said. I've been searching for hours. When the car was found empty, I thought... He shuddered. But they're alive. Because of you. Is Sarah okay? Tyson asked. And Hope? Henderson's eyes widened. Hope. The baby. Sarah named her Hope. Fresh tears spilled down the billionaire's cheeks. Hope, he repeated softly. Then louder. I need to see them. But first... He turned to the hospital administrators. This boy gets the best care available. Everything he needs. I'm covering all expenses. Mr. Henderson, Tyson's father, started to protest. Please. Henderson held up a hand. It's nothing compared to what he's given me. He pulled out a business card and pressed it into James's hand. Call my office tomorrow. We have a lot to discuss. With that, he was gone, his entourage trailing behind him. The doctor cleared his throat. Right? Well, let's get you admitted properly. You need rest, fluids, and antibiotics for that leg. The next few hours passed in a blur. They moved Tyson to a private room with a view of the city. The floods were receding, leaving devastation in their wake. Rescue helicopters still circled overhead. News vans began arriving at the hospital around dawn. The story was getting out. Local boy saves billionaire's wife and newborn from flood. Reporters wanted interviews. No press, his mother told the nurses firmly. He needs to rest. But rest wouldn't come. Every time Tyson closed his eyes, he was back in the flood waters, fighting the current, watching the cars sink. Around noon, there was a soft knock at his door. Sarah Henderson entered in a wheelchair, pushed by a nurse. Hope was sleeping in her arms. "Hey, hero," Sarah said softly. Tyson's parents quietly left the room, giving them privacy. "How are you feeling?" Tyson asked. "Sore, tired, grateful." She wheeled closer to his bed. "Robert told me he met you. I hear he made quite a scene. He was worried about you. He was going crazy. When I didn't arrive at the evacuation center." She shuddered. "But we're safe. Thanks to you." Hope stirred, opening her tiny eyes. Sarah adjusted her position so Tyson could see her better. "She's so small," he said. 6 pounds, 4 ounces. Perfect in every way. Sarah touched her daughter's cheek. "The doctors say if she'd been born in that flood." She didn't finish the sentence. "She didn't need to. Robert's lawyers are already working on your brother's case," she said instead. "They're requesting an emergency hearing." Tyson's heart jumped. "Really? Really? The best criminal defense team in Texas is on it." She reached for his hand. "We're going to get him out, Tyson. I promise." Before he could respond, another knock came at the door. A nurse poked her head in. "Mr. Walker? There's a reporter from CNN here." "And ABC News." "And no," Sarah said firmly. "No press. Not yet." She turned to Tyson. "Unless you want to—" Tyson shook his head. He didn't want cameras or microphones. He just wanted to sleep without seeing flood waters behind his eyelids. "Tell them to talk to my husband's PR team," Sarah told the nurse. "Mr. Walker is resting." After the nurse left, Sarah was quiet for a moment, just watching Hope breathe. "You know what the craziest part is?" she finally said. "When I first saw you swimming toward the car, I almost told you to go back. I thought, he's just a kid. He'll get himself killed trying to save us." "I almost did go back," Tyson admitted. "When I hit that fence post underwater, I almost gave up, but you didn't." "No." Hope made a small sound, like she was agreeing. "The news is calling you a hero," Sarah said. Tyson looked out the window at the receding floods. "I'm not. I just did what needed doing." "That's exactly what makes you a hero." Sarah squeezed his hand. "And now it's our turn to help you." Another knock at the door. This time it was Robert Henderson, looking more composed than before. "The lawyers have good news," he announced without preamble. "They found 3 witnesses who can corroborate Marcus's alibi. The original prosecutor is cooperating. We might have him home by next week." Tyson's vision blurred with tears. "That's not all," Henderson continued. "Sarah told me about your family's situation. The eviction notice, the financial struggles. I'd like to help, if you'll let me." "We don't need charity," Tyson said automatically, echoing his father's words. "It's not charity." Henderson's voice was firm. "It's an investment. In you. In your future." He sat on the edge of Tyson's bed. "How would you feel about a full scholarship? Any school you want. All expenses paid through college." Tyson couldn't speak. "Say yes," Sarah urged softly. "Let us do this for you." Hope chose that moment to start crying, a healthy, demanding wail that made everyone smile. "Someone agrees," Henderson said, reaching for his daughter. He held her like she was made of glass. "May I ask, why Hope?" "Because that's what he gave us," Sarah answered, looking at Tyson. "When everyone else walked away, when I thought it was the end, he gave us hope." Outside the window, the sun was finally breaking through the clouds. The worst of the storm had passed. Tyson watched the Henderson family, Robert cradling Hope, Sarah beaming at them both, and felt something warm in his chest. For the first time since Marcus was taken away, he could see a future that wasn't dark. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay what?" Henderson asked. "Okay to the scholarship, to the lawyers, to all of it." Tyson managed a small smile. "But I have one condition." "Name it." "When Marcus gets out, he gets the same chance. To study, to build a future." Henderson's eyes softened. "Done. No conditions needed. Your brother deserves justice, and you both deserve every opportunity." Hope's cries subsided to little hiccups. Outside, more helicopters passed overhead, Not rescue missions now, but news choppers trying to get footage of the aftermath. Get some rest, Sarah said, wheeling herself toward the door. Tomorrow's going to be busy. Tomorrow? The world wants to meet the boy who jumped into a flood to save a stranger, Henderson explained. But that can wait. For now, just rest. They left quietly, taking Hope's soft baby sounds with them. Tyson sank back against his pillows, exhaustion finally winning. Just before sleep took him, his phone buzzed, newly dried and working again. A text from an unknown number. Your brother's lawyers are on their way to the prison now. Hearing scheduled for Monday. Rest well, hero. R.H. Tyson closed his eyes, and for the first time since the rescue, he didn't see flood waters in the darkness. Instead, he saw hope. 3 days after the flood, Tyson stood in front of a modest 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood. His legs still ached where the stitches pulled, but he barely noticed it as he stared at the sold sign in the front yard. Is this really ours? His mother whispered, clutching the keys Robert Henderson's realtor had just handed her. All yours, Mrs. Walker, the realtor confirmed. Mr. Henderson insisted on handling everything. Down payment, closing costs, even the furniture inside. James Walker ran his hand along the porch railing. Never thought I'd own a house. Want to see inside? The realtor asked. They walked through the front door into a large living room with hardwood floors. Everything was new. The furniture, the appliances, even the paint on the walls. But it wasn't flashy or excessive. The Hendersons had understood that the Walkers weren't looking for luxury, just stability. 3 bedrooms upstairs, the realtor explained, including one that's already set up for Marcus. Tyson's heart skipped. The hearing was tomorrow. Henderson's lawyers were confident, but still, his phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, just check with the legal team. Everything's ready for tomorrow. Robert's coming to testify, personally. Another buzz, Hope says hi. Attached was a picture of the baby, 1 week old now, sleeping peacefully in her nursery. Tyson, his mother called from upstairs. Come see your room. He climbed the stairs, his leg protesting slightly. The doctor had said it would be sore for a few weeks, but there wouldn't be any permanent damage. His bedroom was bigger than his old one, with a desk by the window and a new laptop sitting on it. A note was propped against the screen. For your studies. The scholarship paperwork is in the drawer. R.H. baby, are you crying? His mother asked softly. Tyson wiped his eyes quickly. No, just it's a lot. She pulled him into a hug. You deserve this. All of it. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Mrs. Rodriguez. The community center is starting swimming lessons next month. They want you to help teach. That made him smile. After the story hit the news, donations had poured into the community center. They were rebuilding, expanding, adding programs. The reporters are outside again. His father called from downstairs. They've been everywhere since the story broke. Television crews, newspaper photographers, social media influencers. Everyone wanted to interview the hero of Houston. Let them wait, his mother said. We're having a family moment, but it wasn't just reporters outside. Their old neighbors had gathered too, helping unload the moving truck. Mr. Washington was directing traffic. Mrs. Rodriguez had brought food. Even Mr. Peterson, their former landlord, had shown up, looking awkward but apologetic. Need any help? A familiar voice asked. Sarah Henderson stood in the doorway. Hope strapped to her chest in a baby carrier. Robert was behind her, carrying a large gift-wrapped box. You didn't have to come, Tyson said. With the baby? Try stopping her, Robert chuckled. She insisted. Sarah walked over to Tyson and carefully extracted Hope from the carrier. Want to hold your goddaughter? Tyson took the baby gently. She was heavier than she looked and more alert now. Her tiny hand gripped his finger. The house okay? Robert asked, trying to sound casual. It's perfect, Tyson's mother assured him. More than perfect. Good? Because there's one more thing. Robert set down the box. Open it. Inside was a framed document, legal papers. Tyson read the heading and almost dropped them. Is this? Marcus's release papers, Robert confirmed. Already signed by the judge. Just needs to be processed tomorrow morning. By this time tomorrow, he'll be home. Tyson's mother burst into tears. His father had to sit down. How? Tyson managed to ask. Those lawyers you hired weren't just good. They were angry, Robert explained. Once they started digging, well, let's just say several people in the DA's office are going to have some explaining to do. 3 years, Tyson's mother whispered. They took 3 years of his life. And we can't give those back, Sarah said softly. But we can make sure his future is secure. The trust fund is already set up. Enough for college, starting a business, whatever he wants to do. Hope squirmed in Tyson's arms, demanding attention. He looked down at her perfect little face and felt the weight of everything that had changed in 1 week. I don't know how to thank you, he said. You already did, Sarah touched his arm. 1,000 times over. More cars were pulling up outside, news vans, probably, but also regular people carrying food and housewarming gifts. The whole neighborhood had turned out. Should we tell them about the community center? Robert asked his wife. Sarah nodded. The rebuild plans are approved. New pool, better equipment, free programs for local kids. We're naming it after you, she told Tyson. No, he said quickly. Name it after Marcus. He's the one who taught me to stand up for what's right. The Hendersons exchanged a look. Done, Robert said. Hope started to fuss. Sarah took her back, soothing her with practiced ease. We should go, she said. Let you all settle in, but we'll see you tomorrow at the hearing. Tyson nodded. He couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. After they left, he stood at his new bedroom window, watching the crowd below. People were setting up tables, bringing out food, turning the move into an impromptu block party. His phone buzzed one more time. A text from the prison. Your brother says to tell you he loves you. See you tomorrow. The sun was setting over Houston, painting the sky in shades of gold. The flood waters had receded, leaving mud and debris behind. But also something else, a sense of community, of people coming together. Tyson, his mother called. Come eat something. He took one last look at the scene below, at the house that was now their home, at the future that had seemed impossible just a week ago. Then he went downstairs to join his family, his leg aching less with each step. Tomorrow, Marcus would come home. Tomorrow, they would start their new life. But tonight, they would celebrate how far they'd already come. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, Tyson heard laughter from outside, saw shadows dancing on the walls from the setting sun. The sound of children playing, adults talking, life going on. His father met him at the door, tears in his eyes. You did this, James said softly. You gave us all this. Tyson shook his head. We did it together, but he knew it wasn't quite true. One decision, to jump into those floodwaters when everyone else walked away, had changed everything. Sometimes the biggest acts of courage looked like madness at first. Sometimes hope came in the most unexpected moments. And sometimes, Tyson realized as he stepped out into the warm evening air, heroes didn't wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they were just skinny kids who couldn't walk away when someone needed help. The block party was in full swing now. Tomorrow would bring more changes, more challenges, more opportunities. But tonight was for celebrating. Tonight was for hope. 1 month after the flood, Tyson stood at the edge of the new community center pool, watching his brother teach a swimming class. Marcus moved through the water with natural grace, demonstrating the freestyle stroke to a group of wide-eyed kids. Remember, Marcus called out, the key is staying calm. Panic is what gets you in trouble. Tyson touched the scar on his leg, mostly healed now, just a thin white line. The memory of that night still felt fresh. The cold water, the current, Sarah's face behind the car window. Yo, little brother. Marcus waved him over. Come show these kids how it's done. The children watched eagerly as Tyson slipped into the pool. At 13, he wasn't much older than them, but they looked at him like he was something special. The story of the flood rescue had made him a local legend. Mr. Tyson, one little girl asked, were you scared when you saved the ladies? Yes, he answered honestly. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right anyway. Marcus smiled. He'd been home for 3 weeks now, adjusting to freedom, to family, to a world that had changed while he was away. The wrongful conviction had left its marks, quiet moments when his eyes went distant, nightmares that woke him shouting. But he was healing. All right, class dismissed, Marcus announced. Same time next week. As the kids climbed out of the pool, Tyson noticed Sarah Henderson standing by the entrance, Hope sleeping in her stroller. How's it going? She asked, walking over. Good, Marcus answered. These kids are learning fast. Sarah smiled. Just like their teachers, the renovation of the community center had been completed in record time, thanks to Henderson money and community volunteers. The new pool gleamed under LED lights and state-of-the-art equipment filled the gym. On the wall, a plaque read, "The Marcus Walker Community Center, where hope begins." "Robert wanted me to remind you about dinner tonight," Sarah said. "He's grilling steaks." The Hendersons had made it their mission to help the Walkers adjust to their new life. Not with charity, but with opportunities. Robert had helped James start his own construction company. Sarah had connected their mother with better-paying cleaning contracts. And both brothers had full scholarships waiting when they were ready. "We'll be there," Marcus promised. "Just gotta lock up here." Hope stirred in her stroller, making little cooing sounds. She was bigger now, more alert, her eyes tracking movement. Tyson still found it hard to believe that just a month ago, she'd been born in the middle of a hurricane. "She's starting to recognize you," Sarah said as Tyson knelt by the stroller. "Watch." Sure enough, Hope's face lit up when she saw him. Her tiny hands reached out. "She knows her guardian angel." Sarah touched Tyson's shoulder. "Though you hate when I call you that." "Because I'm not." Tyson stood up. "I just did what anyone would do." "But they didn't," Marcus said quietly. "You did?" The sound of squealing tires outside made them all turn. A news van had pulled up again. "Don't they ever give up?" Marcus muttered. "I'll handle it," Sarah said firmly. She marched outside, every inch the billionaire's wife. Through the glass doors, they could see her sending the reporters away. "She's good at that," Marcus observed. "Lots of practice." Tyson started helping him put away the pool equipment. They camped outside our house for 2 weeks straight. The media frenzy had eventually died down, but the story had left its mark. People recognized Tyson on the street. Kids at school treated him differently. The mayor had given him a key to the city. But none of that mattered as much as having his brother back. "You know what I thought about in prison?" Marcus asked suddenly, coiling a lane rope. "Swimming. The feeling of being free in the water. Kept me sane sometimes." Tyson didn't know what to say to that. "Then I get out and find out my little brother became a hero by swimming." Marcus shook his head. "Life's funny sometimes." "I learned from you," Tyson said. "You always told me to stand up for what's right." "Yeah, and look where that got me." But Marcus was smiling. Sir came back inside. Reporters handled. Ready to go. They finished cleaning up and headed out to the parking lot. The Hendersons' driver was waiting with their car. Another car would take the Walker brothers home to change before dinner. The late afternoon sun painted Houston in warm colors. Most signs of the flood were gone now, but its impact lingered in other ways. Neighbors checked on each other more. People smiled and waved. The community was stronger. "Oh, I almost forgot," Sarah said as they walked to the cars. Robert heard from the DA's office. They're investigating the detective who handled Marcus's case. Looking into other arrests he made too. Marcus nodded slowly. "Good. Maybe help some other folks who got wronged." "The lawyers think there might be a civil suit," Sarah continued. "Substantial compensation for wrongful imprisonment." "Don't need it," Marcus said. "Got everything I need right here." He threw an arm around Tyson's shoulders. Hope made a demanding noise from her stroller. "And you too, Princess," Marcus laughed. "Can't forget the namesake of Hope itself." They reached the cars. The driver opened doors for Sarah and Hope. "See you boys at 7, Sarah said. "Don't be late." Robert's very proud of his grilling skills. As they watched the Hendersons' car pull away, Marcus turned to his brother. "You changed everything, you know that?" Tyson shrugged. "Just at what needed doing." "No." Marcus's voice was serious. "You did more than that. You showed people what courage looks like, what justice looks like." He looked at the community center behind them. "What hope looks like." Their own car was waiting. The driver, who'd once been wrongfully imprisoned himself, one of Robert's many careful kindnesses, stood patiently by the door. "Race you home." Marcus grinned. "Loser has to tell Dad's bad jokes at dinner." "You're on." Tyson laughed. As they drove through the streets of Houston, Tyson thought about everything that had changed in 1 month. His family's new home, Marcus's freedom, the community center, Hope's birth, all because of one moment, one choice in the rain. He thought about the floodwaters, how cold they'd been, how close he'd come to turning back. But he hadn't turned back. And now here they were, headed to dinner with billionaires who'd become friends, with a brother who'd come home, with a future that seemed limitless. The car turned onto their street. Kids were playing basketball in driveways. Parents sat on porches. Normal life, but somehow better. "Hey," Marcus said softly. "Thank you for not giving up on any of it." Tyson looked at his brother, really looked at him. The prison pallor was fading. The haunted look in his eyes was softer. He was healing. They all were. "That's what family does," Tyson said simply. The car stopped in front of their house. Their home. Above them, the sky was clear and bright, with no sign of storms, but Tyson knew now that even when storms came, and they would come, you didn't have to face them alone. Sometimes the biggest miracles started with the smallest acts of courage. Sometimes hope came in unexpected ways. And sometimes the real heroes were just ordinary people who refused to walk away when someone needed help. Marcus squeezed his shoulder. "Come on, let's get ready for dinner." They walked into their house together, brothers again, finally whole. Behind them, the sun set on Houston, painting the sky in shades of promise. And somewhere in the city, a baby named Hope dreamed sweet dreams, safe and sound, because one boy had dared to swim against the current.